Hey gang. So we have looked at slavery in our first video. We today are going to take a look at, very briefly, I'm going to get up to number 12, might even get up to 13, we'll see. But just to kind of go through some of these things, we know that it took about 40 to 90 days for a slave ship to go from Africa to the colonial world. Remember, it was based off of where it left. So if it left in southern West Africa and had to go to the Caribbean, obviously that's going to take longer than if it were going from West Africa to Brazil. The difference between the loose packer and the tight packer, a loose packer believing that if you brought on fewer slaves, that the ship would not be susceptible to disease. Slaves would likely finish the voyage, which, and casually said, that's a horrible way of thinking about it, but that more slaves would survive. Therefore, you would have less likely disease and death. Whereas a tight packer says, no, we're going to bring on as many as we can because the more bodies, the better. If some die, they die. That's the way it is. About 10 to 14 million Africans were torn from their homelands and sold into slavery. That's the answer to number 8. The reason why we don't know that exact number, it's not like records were kept and they were perfect. And also, still trying to get over this cough, sorry. And also, if you think about it, some slave ships smuggled slaves, and then not all slave ships kept track of those that died. For insurance purposes, really, too, is that some slave ship owners wouldn't record all of the number of slaves because they didn't want to lose money on insurance if some of those slaves were to have died. So, again, we're looking at between 10 to 14 million Africans being taken from Africa to the colonial world, and nearly 2 million of them would die. 2 million of them would perish and would be, think about that. 2 million souls would die from Africa to the colonies, most, if not all, thrown overboard into the ocean. And in some cases, remember, some ship owners drowned slaves that revolted, or drowned slaves hoping that they could collect money off of the insurance for the quote death of a slave. Where did most of them end up? When I scroll down to this map, remember we saw that video, that infographic of where did most Africans end up, this animated interactive map. Again, I highly suggest you watch this if you haven't done so already, or if you want to see it again. Remember, each dot is one of the 20,528 voyages documented over the 315-year history of the transatlantic slave trade. And again, where did most Africans end up? If we look at the map right here, it shows that most of them ended up in Brazil. More than 40% of all slaves ended up in Brazil. And then just almost up to 40% ended up in the Caribbean islands. Those that ended up in the Caribbean islands likely then made their way to the colonial world and eventually the United States. And I'd mentioned in class also that places like Cuba, Haiti, Barbados, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Brazil, and Charleston, those were predominantly black cities and black colonies and black areas because they were slave trading hubs. That's where they went. That's where they were taken. Okay? Now, excuse me again. If I go back to the questions, we've tackled a few of these already. We have looked at question number 6. We looked at number 7 already. Now we've looked at number 8. And now number 9 we should know off top of our head because we looked at this earlier. In 1619, the first Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. That's the first colony with slavery. And then remember I told you in class I made a mistake. Number 10 and 11 are out of order. I'm going to answer number 11 right now because this is the jobs. This is in chronological order of this is in the order of the document. I made a mistake. That's my first mistake. Block 7's taking notes of how many mistakes I made. This is the first one of the year, so deal with it. So number 11 asks us, what were some of the jobs slaves had in the American colonies, and what types of jobs are these, and do they have anything in common with each other? Block 2 did a really good job of putting together that most of these jobs had to do with livestock or had to do with menial or laborious tasks that really didn't require any skill. And if we scroll down in the document, we see on page 12 that these are some of the jobs that slaves were forced to do. They fell trees, cutting down trees. They built homes. They were coopers making barrels. So if you have a friend named Cooper, they're a barrel. They cooked food. They were carpenters, sailors. They built roads. They physically took down forests and wilderness to create paths and roads. They built bridges, dug mines. They cleaned the homes. They're the ones who raised the animals on the farms. They were tailors, which means they fix clothes. And that means I need to have a button fixed on my button-down shirt. They planted crops, converted cane to sugar. I scroll up here for the cane sugar. Remember, sugar was the most labor-intensive crop in the colonies. It was called white gold. Sugar is a preservative, much like salt and pepper, and they're also a band, which makes it easier for food to, well, taste better, duh. And if you worked on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean islands, cutting down this cane sugar, as you see here in the picture, your life expectancy was about 25 years old. It was absolutely backbreaking labor. You were cutting down trees all day long. You were grinding up sugarcane into sap all day long, and then you're around this sugary sweet substance, which brewed disease from mosquitoes. And, in doing so in the hot sun, your life expectancy was at the lowest on these sugar plantations because of the spread of rampant disease and working so hard. But sugar sold for so much money, and it was considered, again, white gold, that people wanted to have sugar plantations. We see also that slaves dug canals. They were blacksmiths, which means they worked with metal. Watchmakers, converting trees to lumber, so cutting down the trees but turning them into boards for lumber. Those that were physically incapable of really doing anything else, they were carriage drivers. They led irrigation to fields, made shoes, killed animals, made tools. And again, as we read here, depending on which colony slaves lived in, it depended on how they were treated. But you still need to understand the concept. They're still slaves. So saying that a slave was treated better in one colonial region, a perspective point still, they're still slaves, right? Now, if I scroll back up to the questions, hopefully I'm going to be healthy next week because that would be amazing. If we go to the next question, we're going to take a look at number 10. Why do we think slaves revolted, and how do we think they revolted, and why do you think their revolts would be successful? Think to yourself for a second whether or not slave revolts would even be successful. I mean, you might in some cases think, yeah, of course, they overthrew and they killed their masters, or they killed people in the town. That's very temporary. But if you think about it, slaves were different skin color. So they were easy to point out by whites and by slave owners and by, well, really freed people that if you were black, you were likely a slave. So these revolts were not successful. Most slaves that were successful, as they would say, in their revolts, they would be killed or sold off. So there wouldn't be these revolts where all of a sudden the slaves take over the town or they take over that did not happen. If we look at slavery, see right here I have again, sorry, this is a little tangent, but see what I mean by heavily labor. In the Carolinas, the Caribbean was the worst. This is the sugar plantation again. So again, white gold here. Now, if I go back to slave insurrections and rebellion, this section talks about how slaves revolted. Now, if you think about it, we likely think about physical rebellion. You probably think that slaves tried to overthrow their masters, or slaves tried to kill their masters, or they tried to destroy the towns. In some cases, slaves revolted in many different ways. Slaves would grind glass and put it in the foods of their masters so that they would be eating glass and they may die from internal bleeding. Some slaves would even mutilate themselves, maybe cut their finger off or break their own arm or their leg so that way they physically couldn't work. That's a form of rebellion because they're rebelling against the slave master, saying they're not working. In some cases, slaves would break tools, maybe work slower, maybe accidentally burn food, even though it's not an accident, break windows when they're putting things together in the house. Basic things like this were forms of rebellion. Think about this too, Africans that came, they were Muslims, and when they came to the Americas, they were not allowed to practice their religion. They were forced to learn English. They were forced to accept Christianity in some cases. They were forced to abandon old African customs. So one way that slaves would revolt, they would also try to practice their religions and customs without their masters knowing. What we're going to look at in class together is a slave named Nat Turner, and we're going to take a look at some of the rebellions that happened and how slaves revolted. Nat Turner will physically lead a rebellion against his master in Virginia, and then we're going to take a look at some slave codes, which are the laws that slaves had to follow, that colonies had to enforce onto these slaves. And at that point, we're almost done with our slavery unit. So this video tackled, I know I'm scrolling really quickly. If you think about it, what we just did is we answered number 7 all the way to 11, right? And so then we're also, in class, we're going to get through 12 through the rest of them, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this video, and be good.